Bikers threaten a woman on a highway. Her secret leaves them regretting everything. The highway stretched out into the horizon, empty except for the roaring engines of 5 motorcycles cutting through the silence. The bikers moved in formation, their black leather jackets and helmets making them look like predators hunting their next kill. The leader, a towering man with broad shoulders and a cruel smirk, signaled to the others. Up ahead, a woman stood alone in the middle of the road. She didn't run. She didn't even flinch. She just stood there, staring them down. The bikers slowed their approach, their engines growling like caged animals. "What do we have here?" the leader sneered, pulling off his helmet. His name was Deke, and he had spent most of his life intimidating people into giving him whatever he wanted. "You lost, sweetheart?" The woman's dark eyes flickered over them, calm, unreadable. She was dressed in a black leather jacket, tight jeans, and boots, looking like she belonged just as much as they did. "No," she said simply. Deke chuckled, glancing at his crew. "No? You sure about that? Because it looks like you're standing in the middle of the road, all alone, with no way out." The other bikers laughed, their voices carrying across the empty stretch of asphalt. The woman remained unmoved. Deke swung his leg off his bike, stepping closer. "Now, I don't know what kind of suicidal stunt this is, but we don't take kindly to people getting in our way." She tilted her head slightly. "Then maybe you should turn around." The laughter stopped. Deke's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by some woman standing alone on a deserted highway. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he muttered. "But guts don't mean a damn thing out here." He took another step forward, now only a few feet away. The others followed suit, closing in, their hands resting on their belts, where weapons were hidden. The woman didn't move, didn't blink. Instead, she smiled. And that's when everything changed. Deke barely had time to process what was happening before a low rumble filled the air. Not from their bikes. From somewhere else. It started as a distant vibration, growing into a thunderous roar that shook the ground beneath them. Deke turned, confusion flashing across his face. Then he saw them. Headlights. Dozens of them. Coming fast. Coming for them. And in that moment, Deke realized they weren't the predators here. They were the prey. Deke's stomach twisted as the distant headlights grew larger, their glow stretching across the dark asphalt like an omen. The deep, guttural roar of engines filled the air, drowning out the quiet hum of his own crew's motorcycles. He turned his head sharply toward the woman still standing in front of him, her expression unmoved, as if she had been expecting this all along. His pulse quickened. He had spent his life taking control of situations like this, intimidating people into submission, but now, for the first time in years, he felt something foreign creep into his gut: uncertainty. The other bikers started shifting uneasily on their seats, gripping their handlebars tighter, their confidence visibly cracking. One of them, a man with a scar running down his jawline, muttered under his breath, "Deke, who the hell are they?" The woman finally took a step forward, her boots clicking lightly against the pavement, the movement controlled, measured. She didn't just stand in front of them, she owned the space around her. Her dark eyes settled on Deke, her smirk returning. "Took them long enough," she said casually, as if she were talking about a delayed lunch delivery rather than a convoy of roaring motorcycles charging toward them. Deke gritted his teeth, unwilling to show the unease crawling up his spine. "Who are they?" he demanded, stepping closer, his voice low and edged with frustration. The woman tilted her head, amused by the shift in his tone. "You rolled up on me thinking you were in charge. Now look at you, asking questions instead of giving orders." Deke clenched his fists. He had been sizing her up since the moment they stopped, but now, with the headlights nearly upon them, he was seeing her in an entirely different light. She wasn't just fearless, she was prepared. He glanced back over his shoulder, watching as the approaching motorcycles spread out, fanning across the highway in perfect synchronization. The first few riders came into full view, and Deke felt his jaw tighten. Their bikes were bigger, heavier, custom-built for endurance and power. Their jackets bore a distinct emblem, a wolf's head with deep scars carved into the design. He recognized it instantly. The Shadow Vultures. A crew so infamous that even Deke's own gang, the Iron Reapers, had been warned to stay out of their way. The Vultures didn't just ride, they controlled entire territories, operated in silence, and crushed those who opposed them without hesitation. And this woman, this random woman they had stopped on the highway, was standing in the middle of the road like she had summoned them herself. The Shadow Vultures slowed as they reached them, their engines growling as the air thickened with tension. The leader, a man with silver-streaked hair and a presence that could silence a room, pulled his bike up next to the woman. He didn't look at Deke, didn't even acknowledge his crew. His gaze was locked onto her, and his expression softened in a way that sent an unmistakable message. She wasn't just familiar to them. She was one of them. "Everything all right?" the leader asked, his voice calm but commanding. The woman nodded, gesturing casually toward Deke and his crew. They thought they could have a little fun. Didn't know they were playing in the wrong lane. Deke felt his entire body go rigid. The weight of the situation crashed down on him all at once. He had made a mistake, a massive mistake. His crew had spent years building their reputation, operating like kings on the open road, but they had just stepped on the wrong battlefield. The leader of the Vultures finally turned his gaze toward Deke, assessing him with a slow, unblinking stare. "The Iron Reapers," he muttered, like he was testing the name on his tongue. "I've heard of you." His tone wasn't impressed. It wasn't even interested. It was dismissive, like they weren't even worth his time. Deke straightened his back, trying to salvage what little dominance he had left. "We didn't know she was one of yours," he said, his voice steady but his grip on his belt tightening. "We meant no disrespect." The woman let out a quiet chuckle. "No disrespect?" she echoed. "So what was the plan then? Shake me down? Scare me? Maybe worse?" The accusation hung in the air like a loaded gun. Deke swallowed hard, his crew shifting uncomfortably behind him. The leader of the Vultures exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "You know, there are rules to this life," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "And rule number 1? You don't mess with family." Deke barely had time to react before the Vultures moved. It was fast, too fast. 1 second his crew was standing firm, and the next, they were being dragged off their bikes, shoved onto their knees on the cold pavement. The woman hadn't moved an inch, watching impassively as the men who had threatened her moments ago were now completely at the mercy of her people. Deke's breath came in shallow bursts. He had been in fights before. He had started fights before. But this wasn't a fight. This was a lesson. The leader knelt down in front of Deke, his voice eerily calm. "You got 2 choices," he said. "You can leave here breathing, forget this ever happened, and make sure every Reaper in your crew knows to never cross us again." He paused, letting the second option hang in the air. "Or, we can settle this another way." The implication was clear. Deke's pulse hammered against his skull. He knew the right answer. There was no coming back from this. No spinning the story. No reclaiming power. He had walked into this thinking he was a wolf, only to realize he was standing in the middle of a den filled with bigger, sharper, and far more dangerous predators. He lowered his head. "We'll leave." His voice lacked the arrogance it had carried earlier. The leader nodded once, standing back up. "Smart choice." He gestured to his men, and just like that, the Vultures let go of the Iron Reapers, stepping back as if nothing had happened. The woman watched as Deke and his crew scrambled to pick up their bikes, their hands shaking slightly as they fumbled with their gear. As they revved their engines, ready to take off, Deke couldn't help but steal one last glance at the woman. She was still smirking, her arms crossed, standing amongst some of the most feared bikers in the country like she had always belonged there. He had underestimated her, gravely, and now he was paying the price. Without another word, he twisted his handlebars and sped off into the night, his crew following closely behind. The moment they were gone, the leader turned to the woman with an amused expression. "You always did know how to pick 'em." She shrugged, cracking her knuckles. "They thought I was an easy target." She turned her gaze toward the road, the empty stretch of highway now calm once again. Turns out they were the easy ones. The Vultures let out a collective chuckle, their laughter rolling through the night like distant thunder. As they climbed back onto their bikes, the leader gave her a knowing look. "So, you coming back with us?" She hesitated for just a moment, then swung her leg over her motorcycle. "Yeah," she said, fastening her helmet. "I think it's about time." And with that, they disappeared into the night, leaving only the distant echoes of their engines behind. Deke rode in silence, the wind whipping against his face as his bike tore down the highway. His crew followed behind him, the usual swagger in their riding replaced with a stiff, uneasy rhythm. No one spoke over their earpieces. No one cracked jokes. The weight of their failure settled like a lead chain around their throats, and Deke felt it most of all. His knuckles were white against the handlebars as he replayed the scene in his mind. The woman, her smirk, the way she didn't even flinch when they surrounded her. He had been sure she was just some lost girl on the road, an easy mark. But the way the shadow vultures had appeared like ghosts out of the darkness, the way they had surrounded him and his men without breaking a sweat, that wasn't luck. That was power. Deke had spent years making sure the Iron Reapers were respected on the road. They weren't just some dime-a-dozen biker gang, they were a force. But tonight, he had been reminded that there were bigger forces out there. Stronger ones. And worse, he had made the fatal mistake of crossing one. The crew pulled off at an old gas station on the outskirts of town, the flickering neon sign casting eerie shadows against their bikes. Deke parked first, killing his engine and ripping off his helmet, his jaw tight as he ran a hand through his sweat-drenched hair. "Boss?" Scar, his second-in-command, started, stepping off his own bike hesitantly. "We need to talk." Deke turned sharply. "You think I don't know that?" Scar clenched his jaw. "I mean, we need to talk now. That wasn't just some random run-in. That woman, she was playing us from the start." Deke exhaled, pacing. "I know. We should have seen it," Scar pressed. "No one just stands in the middle of a highway like that, waiting for a gang to roll up on them. She was baiting us." "She didn't just bait us," another biker, Vince, spoke up. "She humiliated us." Deke's fingers curled into fists. He wanted to punch someone, but he had nowhere to aim his rage. Because Vince was right. They had been set up, and the woman had known exactly what she was doing. "What do we do?" One of the younger members, Kev, asked, his voice uncertain. Deke stared at him, his mind racing. His first instinct was revenge. They couldn't let this slide. If word got out, and they'd be seen as weak. And in their world, weakness was death. But he wasn't an idiot. The Shadow Vultures weren't just another gang. They were the gang. If they tried to retaliate, they wouldn't survive the week. Scar folded his arms. "We disappear for a while. Lay low." Vince scoffed. "You wanna run?" "I wanna live," Scar shot back. "And that means not picking a fight we can't win." Deke took a deep breath. "No one's running," he said, his voice level. "But we're not getting ourselves killed either." He stared off at the empty road, his mind working. There had to be another way. A way to save face without digging their own graves. And then it hit him. They didn't need revenge. They needed leverage. Deke smirked, his earlier rage settling into something calmer. More calculated. "We find out who she is." The others exchanged looks. Scar raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we don't go after the vultures. We go after her." Deke crossed his arms. "She's the key to all of this. If she's as important to them as she seemed, then that means she's got secrets. And if we find those secrets first," he trailed off, his meaning clear. Vince grinned. "Then we have something to bargain with." Scar hesitated. "This is dangerous." Deke's smirk widened. "So is doing nothing." The others nodded, the energy shifting. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about power. And they were about to take it back. The Iron Reapers worked fast. Within 2 days, they had a name. Riley Shaw. She wasn't just any biker. She was once one of them. Deke leaned back in his chair, staring at the dossier they had managed to pull together. Riley had been born into the life, raised by a father who had once been a legendary road captain in the Shadow Vultures. But somewhere along the way, she left. The details were fuzzy. Some said she walked away from the Vultures on her own terms. Others said she was forced out. Either way, it was clear. She had history with them. Deke's lips curled into a slow grin. Scar, standing across from him, frowned. "I don't like this." If we use her against them and they find out? Deke cut him off. They won't find out. Scar exhaled, but he didn't argue further. The plan was simple. Find Riley, corner her, and force her to give them an edge over the vultures. And this time, she wouldn't be the one smiling. Riley adjusted her gloves, leaning against her bike outside a small, rundown bar on the city outskirts. She had felt it the moment she left the highway 2 nights ago, the shift in the air. The Reapers wouldn't let things go that easily. They were coming. She just didn't know when. Or so they thought. The moment she heard the sound of approaching motorcycles in the distance, a slow smirk spread across her lips. Right on time. The Iron Reapers pulled up fast, their headlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Deke was the first to step off his bike, his smirk matching hers. Funny seeing you here. Riley arched a brow. You followed me. That's cute. Vince scoffed. Don't act like you didn't see this coming. Riley exhaled, pretending to think. You're right. I did. She gestured toward them. So what's the plan? You want a rematch? Because last time didn't go so well for you. Deke chuckled, but there was no humor in it. We're not here to fight. Scar stepped forward. We know who you are, Riley Shaw. Riley's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second. Do you? Deke took a step closer. We know you used to ride with them. We know you left. And we know they came for you anyway. He tilted his head. Which makes me wonder, do they even trust you? Silence stretched between them. Riley's jaw tightened. Knowing he had struck a nerve. That's what I thought, he murmured. So here's the deal, Riley. We're not looking to go to war with the vultures. That'd be suicide. But you're a free agent. You're not one of them anymore, which means you're not untouchable. He let that last word hang in the air, letting the weight of the statement sink in. Riley crossed her arms, forcing her expression to remain neutral. And what exactly do you think you're gonna do? She asked, her tone measured. Intimidate me? Beat me up? Threaten me into giving you something? She let out a short laugh. I'd love to see you try. Deke smirked, but there was a sharpness in his eyes. We don't need to lay a hand on you. We just need to talk. He nodded toward the bar. Why don't we go inside, have a drink, and discuss a little business? Riley glanced at the bar, then back at the bikers surrounding her. The Reapers had come prepared. Even if she wanted to make a run for it, she'd have to fight her way through at least 6 of them first. She weighed her options, her fingers twitching slightly at her sides. Then, with a sigh, she shrugged. She said, let's talk. The group moved toward the bar, the tension thick between them. Riley walked in first, keeping her head high, her movements casual. Inside, the place was dimly lit, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of stale beer. A few regulars glanced up from their drinks, but no one paid much attention. The bartender gave Riley a nod. She had been here before, but his eyes flickered warily toward the Reapers trailing behind her. Deke gestured toward a booth in the back, and Riley slid in first, keeping her back to the wall. She didn't trust these guys enough to let them out of her sight. Deke and Scar sat across from her, while the others hovered close by, blocking any potential escape route. Deke leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Here's the deal, he said. We don't care about you. But we do care about them. Riley tapped her fingers against the table. Let me guess, you want leverage. A way to make sure the vultures don't come after you for what happened on the highway. Deke nodded. Exactly. And you're gonna help us? Riley scoffed. Yeah? And why the hell would I do that? Deke leaned back, smirking. Because if you don't, we make sure word gets out that you've been talking to us. And I don't think the vultures would take that too kindly. Riley narrowed her eyes. That's a bold assumption. You think they'd believe you over me? Deke chuckled. I don't need them to believe me. I just need them to doubt you. And from what I hear, your place with them isn't as secure as you'd like to pretend. Riley's jaw clenched. He wasn't wrong. Her return to the vultures hadn't exactly been smooth. Some of them still questioned where her true loyalties lay. The last thing she needed was the Reapers stirring the pot. She exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. What do you want? She asked. Scar leaned in slightly. Information. We need to know what the vultures have planned. We need to know how they operate, where they move, and who their biggest players are. Riley raised an eyebrow. You're asking me to betray them? Deke shrugged. Call it whatever you want. We just need something we can use. Riley tilted her head, studying them. And if I refuse? Deke's smirk returned. Then we let nature take its course. Riley didn't respond right away. She let the silence stretch, forcing them to wonder what she was thinking. Inside, her mind was racing. She knew she couldn't give them real intel. The vultures would find out, and it would be her head on a spike. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn this against them. Finally, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. She said, I'll think about it. Deke grinned. That's all we needed to hear. But what Deke didn't know was that Riley was already planning her next move. He thought he had her cornered, thought he had finally regained control of the situation. He had no idea that she was about to turn the tables on him. Riley leaned back against the worn-out leather of the booth, her expression carefully neutral as Deke and Scar exchanged satisfied glances. They thought they had her. They thought she was cornered. But what they didn't realize, what they never realized, was that Riley Shaw had spent her entire life dodging traps like these. And she never walked into one without a way out. She exhaled through her nose, feigning resignation as she swirled the untouched drink in front of her. So, she said, keeping her voice even, you want intel on the vultures. What exactly are you looking for? Deke smirked. Everything. Their shipments, their allies, their weaknesses. Riley tapped her fingers on the table, pretending to consider it. She already knew how this would play out. She'd give them something, but not enough to be useful. Just enough to buy time. Scar leaned in slightly. You don't have to sell them out completely, Riley. Just something we can use to keep them off our backs. She lifted a brow. And what happens when they find out I told you? Deke shrugged. That's your problem. Riley fought the urge to roll her eyes. Classic Reapers. They had no loyalty, no code, just a desperate need to climb higher, even if it meant stepping on people along the way. She exhaled sharply. Fine. I'll get you something. But you don't contact me again. I'll send the intel when I have it, and then we're done. Deke grinned, clearly convinced that he'd won. Smart choice. Riley smiled back, but there was no warmth behind it. They thought they had her, but they had no idea what they had just walked into. Riley's fingers drummed against the worn steering wheel of her truck as she sat parked on the side of a deserted road, her headlights off, the engine humming softly beneath her. She had spent years in this game, long enough to know that the Reapers wouldn't just walk away once she gave them what they wanted. No, they'd keep coming back. They'd squeeze every last drop of information out of her until there was nothing left. And then they'd dispose of her. So, she was about to make sure they never got the chance. She reached into the glove compartment, pulling out an old burner phone and dialing a number she hadn't called in a long time. After 2 rings, a deep, familiar voice answered. Was wondering when I'd hear from you. Riley smirked, glancing at the rearview mirror as a lone pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Yeah? Well, I've got something you'll want to hear. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, the Reapers? Yep, she said, popping a cigarette between her lips but not lighting it. They think they have leverage over me. They think I'm gonna feed them intel on the vultures. A low chuckle. That's so? She smirked. They don't know I'm feeding them bait. The headlights behind her grew closer. They're meeting me tomorrow, she continued. And I think it's about time the vultures remind them who really runs these roads. The voice on the other end hummed thoughtfully. And what do you want out of this, Riley? She exhaled slowly, watching the approaching car slow to a stop behind her. I want them gone. For good. There was another pause. A click. Line disconnected. Riley smirked as she slid the phone back into the glove compartment. She already knew how tomorrow would play out. Deke and his boys thought they had the upper hand. But by the time the sun set tomorrow, the Iron Reapers wouldn't exist anymore. The next evening, Riley waited at the agreed-upon meeting spot, a secluded warehouse lot on the edge of town, far away from prying eyes. She sat on her bike, arms crossed, posture relaxed. But her mind was anything but. She was calculating. Waiting. The Reapers arrived a few minutes later, their bikes growling as they came to a stop in a loose semicircle around her. Deke dismounted first, his usual cocky smirk in place. Scar and Vince weren't far behind, their eyes sharp, predatory. Riley raised an eyebrow. "You brought backup?" Deke chuckled. "Can never be too careful." She nodded, tilting her head. "That's funny. I was thinking the same thing." Before Deke could react, the unmistakable sound of engines roared in the distance. But not just any engines. Vulture engines. Deke's smirk vanished as he turned, watching as the shadow vultures rolled into the lot like a storm. There were at least 20 of them, their black bikes cutting through the darkness like sharpened blades. The Reapers tensed. Scar cursed under his breath. "Deke, what the hell is this?" Deke's jaw was clenched so tight it looked like his teeth might crack. He turned back to Riley, his expression dark. "What did you do?" Riley swung her leg over her bike, standing up to face him. "You thought you could use me to get an edge over the vultures," she said calmly, taking a few steps closer. "But what you didn't realize is," she smirked, "I was always one of them." Deke's face twisted with realization, his eyes darting between Riley and the approaching vultures. He had played right into her hands. The leader of the Shadow Vultures, Nick Dalton, finally pulled up beside Riley, stepping off his bike with a lazy confidence that only came from knowing you've already won. He barely glanced at Deke and his men. His focus was on Riley. "You sure about this?" he asked her. Riley didn't hesitate. "Positive." Nick nodded once before turning his gaze on Deke. "You crossed the wrong person," he said, his voice dangerously smooth. "And now you don't get to walk away." Deke's fingers twitched toward his belt, toward the gun holstered there. Nick smirked. And then everything exploded into chaos. The vultures moved first. 1 second, the lot was tense, unmoving. The next, fists were flying, weapons were drawn, and the air was thick with the sounds of bodies hitting pavement. Deke managed to get a shot off, but it missed. Before he could fire again, Riley was on him. She grabbed his wrist, twisting it with a sharp, practiced movement until he dropped the gun with a pained grunt. Then she brought her knee up, slamming it into his gut. Deke stumbled back, coughing, eyes wide. He had underestimated her from the start, and now it was too late. Around them, the rest of the Reapers were being torn apart. Scar tried to run. He didn't get far. Vince went down hard, blood trailing from his lip as 2 vultures pinned him against a bike. And Deke? He fell to his knees, panting, glaring up at Riley with pure, seething hatred. She crouched down, tilting her head. "This is the part where you beg," she mused. Deke spat blood onto the pavement. "Go to hell." Riley smirked. "Already been there." Nick stepped beside her. "What do you want to do with him?" She considered it. "I think it's time the Reapers disappear." Nick nodded. "Agreed." And just like that, the Iron Reapers ceased to exist. Deke's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he knelt on the cold pavement, the metallic taste of blood coating his tongue. His ears rang from the chaos around him, fists meeting flesh, the grunts and gasps of his men as they were overwhelmed by the Shadow Vultures. He had never felt helpless before. Not like this. Not when he had built his entire life on being the one people feared. But now, fear wrapped around his ribs like a vice, tightening with every second that passed. His crew was gone. Scar had been dragged away by 2 vultures, his arms pinned behind him, his struggling useless. Vince had gone down even faster, 1 hard hit to the jaw, and he had crumpled like a house of cards. The younger recruits had scattered, but there was nowhere to run. The vultures had made sure of that. Deke forced himself to look up. Riley still crouched in front of him, her dark eyes studying him like he was an insect pinned to a board. "You really thought you could play me," she mused, her voice almost amused. "That's the funniest thing I've heard all night." Deke's jaw clenched. "You set us up." Riley tilted her head. "You set yourself up." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to something just above a whisper. "I told you to turn around. You didn't listen." Deke had no response. She was right. He had walked into this willingly, thinking he was the one holding the cards, thinking she was a pawn. But Riley Shaw wasn't a pawn. She was the one who flipped the board. Nick Dalton, the leader of the Vultures, took a slow step forward. The man radiated calm, controlled violence. He wasn't like Deke. He didn't need to flaunt his power to make people fear him. His mere presence was a threat all on its own. He looked down at Deke, unimpressed. "You had your chance to walk away," he said simply, "but you pushed too far." Deke refused to look weak. He forced himself to smirk, though his lips split further as he did. "You gonna kill me, Dalton? Take me out and dump me on the side of the road like roadkill?" Nick exhaled, shaking his head. "Oh, that's too easy." He turned to Riley. "What do you want to do with him?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Deke waited, his muscles coiled, his mind racing. There was still a way out. There had to be. Riley's lips pressed together in thought. Then, finally, she exhaled. "Let him live." Deke's stomach dropped. Because the way she said it didn't sound like mercy. Nick raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Riley nodded. "He doesn't get to die. He gets to live with this." She gestured to the scene around them. The Reapers being dismantled, their bikes taken, their colors ripped from their backs. He gets to wake up every day knowing he's nothing. Deke's breath caught in his throat. This was worse than death. Death was quick. Death was final. But humiliation? Defeat? That would haunt him forever. Nick nodded, satisfied. Strip them? The vultures moved instantly. Deke barely had time to react before his jacket was yanked off, his Iron Reaper's patch ripped from the leather. His rings were pulled from his fingers, his belt unbuckled, his weapons confiscated. His crew, what was left of them, were treated the same. The Reapers were being erased. Deke clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. He had nothing left. No crew, no reputation, no power. And Riley Shaw had done it all without lifting a damn finger. Nick crouched down beside him. "I suggest you leave town," he said simply. "Because if I see you again, I won't be as generous." Deke swallowed his pride, forcing himself to nod. It was over. The vultures mounted their bikes, their engines roaring to life. Riley didn't even spare Deke another glance. She had already won. With a deafening roar, the vultures disappeared into the night, leaving only the broken remains of the Iron Reapers in their wake. Deke sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty road ahead of him, the silence pressing in from all sides. He had lost. And the worst part? Everyone would know. Deke sat in the dirt for what felt like hours, his body aching, his pride shattered. The cold pavement beneath him was nothing compared to the suffocating weight of humiliation pressing down on his chest. His Reapers, what was left of them, lay scattered around the lot, some still catching their breath, others too stunned to even move. Their jackets, patches, weapons, all gone. They had been stripped of everything that made them who they were. Scar groaned as he sat up beside Deke, rubbing his bruised jaw. "What the hell do we do now?" Deke didn't answer. Because he didn't know. His mind was blank, emptier than it had ever been. He had spent his whole life building the Reapers, making them feared, respected. And in one night, Riley Shaw had taken it all away. Vince staggered to his feet, swaying slightly. "We can still..." "Still what?" Deke snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "We're done." Scar looked at him like he had been slapped. "What?" Deke forced himself to stand, his legs shaking with exhaustion. He turned to his crew, what little remained of them, and felt nothing. No power, no confidence. Just emptiness. "The Reapers are dead," he said, his voice quieter this time. "We're done." Silence. Scar's nostrils flared. "So that's it? After all these years, you're just gonna roll over?" Deke turned to him, his eyes burning with something raw and unfamiliar. "What the hell do you want me to do, Scar? Go after the vultures? You saw what happened tonight. We're outnumbered. Outmatched?" He exhaled sharply. "There's nothing left to fight for." Vince kicked at the dirt, shaking his head. "This is bullshit." But no one had an alternative. Because Deke was right. The Iron Reapers were no more. The next morning, Deke found himself at a rundown motel on the edge of town, staring blankly at the water-stained ceiling. He hadn't slept. Hadn't even tried. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her smirking face, saw the vultures riding away with everything he had built. A knock at the door snapped him from his thoughts. Deke sat up, running a hand over his face. What? The door opened, and Scar walked in, his expression unreadable. We got a problem. Deke snorted. Just one. Scar ignored him, tossing a folded-up newspaper onto the bed. Deke sighed, grabbing the paper. His stomach dropped as soon as he saw the headline. Iron Reapers disbanded after humiliating defeat. Sources confirm loss of territory. Deke's grip on the paper tightened. They didn't waste any time, did they? He muttered. Scar sat down on the edge of the bed, rubbing his hands together. Word spreading. Every crew in the state knows what happened last night. Some are laughing. Some are already moving in on our old turf. He looked at Deke. We're done, man. Officially. Deke didn't speak. Scar sighed. So what now? You gonna lay low? Disappear? Deke stared at the wall. I don't know. And that was the truth. He had spent so many years being Deke, leader of the Iron Reapers. Now that the title was gone, he didn't know who the hell he was anymore. Scar hesitated before saying, There's one more thing. Deke finally looked at him. What? Scar exhaled, his gaze sharp. Riley. She's still out there? Deke's hands curled into fists. Of course she was. She hadn't just beaten them, she had ended them. And she had done it so damn effortlessly. Scar leaned forward. I know you said we're done. And maybe we are. But I also know you, Deke. You're not the kind of guy who just lets this go. Deke's jaw tightened. Because Scar was right. Every instinct in him screamed for vengeance. But what could he do? Go after Riley alone? That was suicide. He had nothing left. No crew, no weapons, no allies. And yet, the thought wouldn't leave him. Meanwhile, Riley sat at a diner on the outskirts of town, sipping on a cup of coffee as the early morning sun poured through the cracked blinds. She had slept better than she had in years. For the first time in a long time, she was free. No more reapers. No more looking over her shoulder. The roads belonged to the vultures now, and she had made sure they knew she wasn't to be messed with. A waitress refilled her cup, offering a polite smile. Busy morning? Riley smirked. You could say that. As she lifted the cup to her lips, a familiar figure caught her eye through the window. She lowered the mug slowly. Standing across the street, watching her from the shadows, was Deke. Riley exhaled through her nose, setting her cup down with a soft clink. She had known this wasn't over. But the fact that he had come alone? That was interesting. She tapped her fingers against the table, considering her next move. Deke had two options. Walk away and start over. Or do something stupid. And judging by the look in his eyes, she had a feeling it was going to be the latter.